What we're going to try to cover today is we're going to cover ascending and descending pathways. We'd started on ascending pathways last time. We'd gotten as far as carrying the information about proprioception and fine, or sometimes known as discriminative touch, into the central nervous system, and then carrying that information from the primary sensory afferent to the second order neuron, which always crosses the midline, to the third order neuron in the thalamus, up to the motor cortex. We're going to review that pattern again today, and we're going to talk about the pattern of the ascending sensory neurons in the dorsal column medial lemniscus. The dorsal column includes the extensions of the primary sensory afferent. The medial lemniscus contains the processes of the second order neurons. And they are now, the second order neurons are going to be the ones that cross over the midline. Turns out in the DCML or PCML, the second order neurons have their processes in the medial lemniscus. Now, these neurons are carrying information. This pathway is carrying information to the somatosensory cortex about proprioception and fine, sometimes known as discriminative touch. But we have other sensory modalities in terms of somatosensation that are being carried in a slightly different pathway, but arriving at the same place. The other modalities that are being carried will be pain, temperature, and pressure. Pain, temperature, and pressure find their way through the ascending pathways in something known as the spinothalamic tract. Now, I want you to know this term because it's a kind of language that we use in neuroanatomy all the time. When you see spinothalamic, it tells you this first syllable, spino, tells you that the neuronal cell body is found in the spinal cord. Thalamic tells you that's the output region. So it tells you there's going to be a tract of conductal regions that extend from the input region of the neuron in the spinal cord to the output region in the thalamus. And we'll see this pattern in nomenclature occurring over and over again. Then I want to talk a little bit about Brown-Séquard. And the reason I bring up Brown-Séquard is a hemisection of the spinal cord. We cut the spinal cord just to the midline. And the reason I want to walk you through this is that if you understand what happens in Brown-Séquard syndrome, and you understand what information is blocked and what information still gets through, then you understand the distinction between the ascending sensory tracts carrying information about pain, temperature, and pressure in the spinothalamic tract, and the pathway carrying information about proprioception and fine touch in the dorsal column system. We'll walk through Brown-Séquard. I think it gives a much better insight into how this is working if you can see why you lose some modalities and not others in Brown-Séquard syndrome. Then what we'll do is we'll take this information all the way up to the brain, all the way up to the cerebrum, all the way up to the somatosensory cortex. As we talk about the cerebrum, recognize the cerebrum is a substantial part of the brain. And when you look at a brain, when you look at an image of the brain, normally what you're looking at is the cerebrum. But most of that cerebrum is composed of axons, composed of white matter. Only a very small amount of the cerebrum is composed of this thin veneer of 6 neuronal cell bodies. But that thin veneer of 6 neuronal cell bodies, called the gray matter, is where all of the synaptic activity occurs. So it's important to recognize when you talk about the cerebrum that it's only the very thin outer regions, no more than a couple of millimeters thick. That's where all the synaptic activity, where all the integration is occurring. Then all of the axons coming from those 6 neuronal cell body layers are now distributed to all parts of the brain, and they're distributed to all parts of the brain by conductal processes in the white matter. Then, once we've come through the concepts of the somatosensory system and the sensory information that is coming into the region of the brain called the post-central gyrus. The post-central gyrus is a portion of the cerebrum that is somatosensory. But we're going to see that just behind that, on the other side of this central sulcus, this great fissure, there's now going to be a precentral gyrus, which is then motor. So when you look at this, post-central gyrus is sensory and motor is precentral, and we'll walk our way through that. Then what we're going to do is we're going to map the body plan of both the sensory and motor cortices. And we're going to see that for each of these cortical regions, the body plan is mapped out in the neurons in those cortices. And this all started about, the understanding this started, probably 70 years ago, when there was a surgeon who literally was poking away at people's brains and asking what they felt and what would happen. And from that, there was now an understanding of the body plan's map on the surface of these regions of the brain. We'll run our way through the somatosensory system, and then we'll move on to the motor system. We really don't have time to talk about the really elegant systems in the parietal cortex, where in the parietal cortex we bring together all the sensory information. We just don't have time to do that. But once that information is brought together, then a decision is made, and we use the motor systems to affect a response. We're back to the three-box model: sensory in, analysis, motor out, and this is going to be part of the motor out. The motor out story here is going to be that there will be an upper motor neuron that's found, whose cell body and input region is found in the motor cortex. That neuron sends a process from the motor cortex down through an area called the internal capsule. The internal capsule is a bundle of myelinated axons. If you take another course, you'll find the internal capsule contains both sensory and motor axons. Here we're only emphasizing the motor. The descending pathway now going from the motor cortex, the axons or conductal regions in the internal capsule, then crossing over the midline in a region called the decussation of the pyramids. So just as the sensory information crossed over on the way up, the motor information also crosses over on the way down and crosses over at the decussation of the pyramids. We're going to label this tract, once it enters the spinal cord, as the corticospinal tract. There's again meaning in that term. Cortico tells you that the neuronal cell bodies are located in the cortex, and the spinal part tells you that its output region will be in the spinal cord. Specifically, we're going to find that the output regions for this corticospinal tract will be in the gray matter of the ventral horn gray matter. And those upper motor neurons now will synapse directly onto lower motor neurons. Then there'll be a monosynaptic pathway for the upper motor neuron to the lower motor neuron, and that lower motor neuron then is going to go out from the central nervous system, as we've seen in the reflex arc. It's going to go out from the central nervous system and join a spinal nerve. And from the spinal nerve, that is then going to innervate muscle. There's a term here that I want you to know, and we probably won't come to it until Monday. But the term we want to talk about is something known as the motor unit. The motor unit has a definition. The motor unit is defined as the lower motor neuron. Put your phone away to appreciate it. Yes, you. Put your phone away, please. Thank you. So, the motor unit is defined as the lower motor neuron and the muscle fibers that it innervates. And each lower motor neuron will innervate several muscle fibers. In some large motor units, it may be as many as several hundred muscle fibers. In small motor units, maybe no more than 10 or 20 muscle fibers. So each motor neuron innervates multiple muscle fibers, but each muscle fiber receives input from only one lower motor neuron. It's an important concept. When the lower motor neuron fires, then multiple muscle fibers will simultaneously contract. And they will simultaneously contract because at the neuromuscular synapse, we have a classical synaptic response. At the neuromuscular synapse, the lower motor neuron releases the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. And those receptors that Langley talked about, this acetylcholine will bind to the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. The binding of the acetylcholine to the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors causes those channels to open. Sodium comes in and depolarizes the muscle fiber membrane. The muscle fiber membrane then, once depolarized, can activate or turn on voltage-gated sodium channels, and we see the same pattern played out again, where the action potential propagates along the membrane and causes muscle contraction. That story we'll have to leave till Monday. But let's begin here with first the DCML that we had last time, also known as the posterior column medial lemniscus. And let's start here, give myself a little more room, with the spinal cord. make that a little more truncated. Then the brainstem. And then a region of the diencephalon known as the thalamus. And finally, a region up here, which we're going to define as a region of the cerebrum called the somatosensory. This is the somatosensory cortex. This is 6 layers of neuronal cell bodies. In the cerebrum. But the pathway that we described yesterday, if we were coming in from the leg, the neuron that we emphasized yesterday was a stretch receptor neuron located in the quadriceps. Muscle. And we followed that neuron. We followed the input region out here in muscle. We followed the conductal region to where its neuronal cell body was located in the dorsal root ganglion. That neuron then entered the spinal cord. Now, in the initial discussion yesterday, we emphasized the importance of the direct synapse between this sensory neuron and the lower motor neuron. And then we further emphasized the idea that a process of this neuron entered the dorsal column system and went up the cord all the way into the region here known as the brainstem. And we said that there was a region in the brainstem where there was a cluster or a grouping of neuronal cell bodies. And this cluster or grouping was known as the dorsal column nucleus. And we said that the pathway that this conductal region was located in was said to be the dorsal or posterior column. And that when we looked at this in cross-section of the spinal cord, we showed the position of the gray matter. And we showed the bilateral symmetry. And we labeled this region up here as the dorsal columns. And in cross-section, what we recognized was that the neuronal cell body out here in the dorsal root ganglion sent a process into the central nervous system. And the one we followed initially was down here into the ventral horn. But there's a branch here that goes into the dorsal columns. That's the branch we're following here. It ascends the cord to the dorsal column nucleus. In the dorsal column nucleus, this neuron synapses onto a second-order neuron that crosses over the midline and ascends the cord, or ascends the central nervous system to this region here called the thalamic relay nucleus. Except for olfaction, all of the sensory input, whether it's visual or whether it's auditory, what have you, has to go through a relay here in the thalamus. But then there's another neuron here, which I'll show in red, with its neuronal cell body have its input region, which now then extends a process up to here in the region known as the somatosensory cortex. Now we can number these and show that it's always a 3-cell chain. This is the primary sensory afferent. In orange, this neuron that crosses over the midline, this is said to be the second order neuron. And finally, this neuron we've shown in red, whose neuronal cell body, whose input region is found in the thalamic relay nucleus, this neuron is said to be the third order neuron. Now remember that this is the dorsal column system, and so the dorsal column system, the DCML, carries information in the somatosensory system. About proprioception. And fine touch. So the example I like to use for this, and it is an example of where we use this system a lot, is you can imagine a time when you've come home late at night and you have forgotten to get your keys out of the backpack. And so you arrive at the door and you realize you've got to go fishing for your keys. So you open up your pack and you go fishing around for your keys, and you feel inside the pack, and you know you can do this, you know you can feel around until you find the keys. And this fine touch proprioception input is going to tell you where in your bag those keys are. You grab your keys, you pull the keys out, but now you have another problem, because on that key ring you have your house key and your car key and your bicycle key and maybe an office key. So now you have to start fidgeting through those keys to find out which one belongs to the door you want to open. We know you can do this by touch and by feel. You can say, oh, that's the car key, that's the house key, that's the office key. I'll take the house key, and then you feel around for the lock on the door, and without seeing anything, you can stick that key into the lock on the door, turn the tumblers, and walk in the house. All of it done in absolute darkness simply by this proprioceptive system. We take it for granted. It's really an astonishing system. As you're sitting there, you know you're sitting upright largely because of the proprioception. As you're sitting there writing something on the paper, your position of your hand and how you're writing those letters is all maintained by this dorsal column system. But now let's take another modality, one we're also all too familiar with. In this case, we have another primary sensory afferent. Let's take one down here from your toe. And this now is going to be a pain-sensitive neuron. It could be temperature, or it could be pressure. Regardless of whether it's pain or temperature or pressure, this neuron is carrying information that it's carrying action potentials that were initiated by pain or temperature, and it follows the same pathway. It's in the same spinal nerve, and it comes up here, and it has a neuronal cell body in the dorsal root ganglion. Then this neuron sends a process into the central nervous system. So now if we follow this neuron in cross-section, where this is a pain-sensitive neuron, this pain-sensitive neuron, with its cell body, now sends a process into the spinal cord. Now, this pain-sensitive neuron is going to have an output region almost immediately after it enters the dorsal horn. Remember, this is gray matter, so this is input regions in cell bodies. So this neuron comes immediately into the spinal cord and forms a synapse. Well, you'll recognize the way we've drawn this, that this is meant to be the primary sensory afferent. That the primary sensory afferent now, you'll know from the generalization, the primary sensory afferent is intended to synapse onto the second-order neuron. So the second-order neuron has its neuronal cell body here in the spinal cord. Sends a process across the midline, because remember the rules are the second-order neuron always crosses the midline. Comes across the midline and ascends the cord on the opposite side and finds its way here to the thalamic relay nucleus. So we can spell this out and say this primary sensory afferent synapses onto a second-order neuron in the dorsal horn. Then that second-order neuron, as all second-order neurons do, crosses over the midline. That's the midline. The dotted black line is the midline, so it crosses over the midline. Goes all the way to the thalamic relay nucleus, and then in the thalamic relay nucleus, the second-order neuron synapses onto a third-order neuron, and then that sends a process all the way into the somatosensory cortex. So now we have shown, in this case, from the right side, we've shown the delivery to the somatosensory cortex on the left side of both information about pain and temperature and crude touch, along with discriminative touch and proprioception. That's how it's delivered. Now let's take the other leg. Let's do the same thing with the other leg. So here on this side is the right leg. No, the left leg, I'm sorry. And the pattern is the same. There's the quadriceps muscle. The primary sensory afferent has its neuronal cell body here in the dorsal root ganglion. Sends a process into the spinal cord and immediately ascends the cord now on the left side until it reaches the dorsal column nucleus. Then, of course, the primary sensory afferent synapses onto the second-order neuron. And the second-order neuron then will cross over the midline and ascend the cord on the opposite side to the thalamic relay nucleus. And then the third-order neuron, the thalamic relay nucleus, then sends a process to the somatosensory cortex. So this is simply the pathway for fine touch and proprioception on the left side. And it's repeated on the right side. So the pattern is the same. And we can also do the same thing with the pain-sensitive neuron down here in the toe. So again, we have the primary sensory afferent. Has a process, comes in to the dorsal root ganglion. The process then comes into the dorsal horn, and immediately in the dorsal horn synapses onto the second-order neuron. The second order neuron then crosses over the midline, ascends the tract, ascends the cord in a region known as the spinothalamic tract. So this is ascending the cord in the spinothalamic tract in such a way that it now forms its synapse in the thalamic relay nucleus. Well, let's take a moment here and just unpack this terminology of spinothalamic. This is important because this is the common nomenclature that we use when we talk about neuroanatomy. When we say spinothalamic, this syllable, spino, tells us the site of the neuronal cell body. You can equally say input region. This part of the word thalamic tells you where the neuron has its output region. So we now have this so-called spinothalamic tract. It's spinothalamic because its cell body is in the spinal cord, and it has its output region in the thalamus. But from there on, the pattern is the same, and then again, we have the red third order neuron going to the somatosensory cortex. Now, the next thing I want to talk about here is something called Brown-Séquard syndrome. The Brown-Séquard syndrome is just a hemisection of the spinal cord. So let's now imagine that we've had a dreadful accident. And let's now imagine that we have basically cut the cord right here. We have severed the cord just to the midline, but no farther. So we've cut the cord at that point. We mentioned this yesterday because we said that if we cut the cord at this point, even if we cut a clear across, that our spinal reflexes remained intact because all we have done here is interrupt the flow of information to the brain. But I want to take a moment here to describe what kind of information gets through and what kind of information is cut. So let's look at this. So let's say we come to this leg, and let's say that we pinch the toe. If we pinch the toe, will that information get through? It won't, because it's intercepted right here. In fact, the second order neuron, this orange second order neuron, is cut. However, if we ask the question, do you know where your left leg is in space? Or if we do some discriminative touch on the left leg, that information, because it's ascending the cord on the left side, will get through just fine. So there's no deficit there. But on the other hand, if we look at the other leg, and now we pinch the toe down here, if we pinch this toe, now what's going to happen to this information? This information is going to come into the cord, it's going to cross the midline, it's going to ascend the cord on the opposite side, find its way to the somatosensory cortex, and so we'll find then that there's no deficit. Pain still gets through. But how about proprioception or fine touch? Because we've cut the dorsal columns here. Information from the same side fails to get through. And so we have a deficit here in fine touch. So if you can walk your way through this, if you really understand this system, and you understand what happens in Brown-Séquard, you understand this concept of what's crossing over where. And you understand why some modalities will get through and other modalities won't. And if you can walk your way through Brown-Séquard, you understand these pathways. It's one of the major reasons that I talk about this. So any questions up to here? Yes?
So would you safely say that when it comes to the crossing over in the secondary input, that it's perfectly different from the left side to the right side, perfectly connected?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure what you're asking.
I'm not going to try to explain it.
Okay, let me try again then. All right, so the symmetry I think that you're referring to is the fact that all of these pathways are symmetrical right-left.
Yeah.
But what's different is that the information about proprioception and fine touch goes up the cord on the same side and doesn't cross over until the brainstem. And that's true both right and left. For the somatosensory part, that is going to be proprioception and fine touch. However, if we think about the other modalities, the modalities being pain and temperature and crude touch, those too are symmetrical, but in a slightly different way, in the sense that in this case, the primary sensory afferent almost immediately synapses onto the second order neuron and ascends the cord. And maybe that would be helpful if we would follow through here in the cross section, where the primary sensory afferent now comes into the spinal cord and almost immediately synapses onto the second order neuron. The second order neuron then sends a process all the way across the gray matter and enters this region in here, known as the spinothalamic tract. So that the spinothalamic tract now is carrying information on the opposite side. It's because now this neuron's crossed over. Primary sensory afferent synapses on the second order neuron, it crosses over, then it ascends in the spinothalamic tract here. This is going to be the spinothalamic tract, all the way up to the thalamus. But then in the thalamus, everybody gets together again. So they all send the third order neurons in the thalamus. And then all the third order neurons then send their processes up to the somatosensory cortex, where they're then arrayed according to where the primary sensory afferent originated. Okay? Okay, got it? All right, good. Anything else? Let's take a moment and walk our way through a couple of slides. This first slide is just to remind you what we mean by the structure of the spinal cord. And what we mean by the structure of the spinal cord is to show the segmental arrangement of the spinal nerves. And again, if you can orient yourself here, you understand the structure of the spinal cord, where this is dorsal, or posterior, this is ventral, or anterior. On the lateral sides of the spinal cord, at segmental intervals, are the dorsal root ganglia. The dorsal root ganglia have the neuronal cell bodies of all somatosensory neurons. Those somatosensory neurons will then extend into the central nervous system. And in some cases, they'll synapse directly onto lower motor neurons for the for the reflex. And the lower motor neuron then exits the cord through the ventral root and then out into the spinal nerves. So that's the structure, a three-dimensional view of the spinal cord. The next figure, this is just a cross-section through the spinal cord, trying to distinguish that which is gray matter and that which is white matter. The gray matter is shown in gray. That's this butterfly structure. The white matter is divided into regions. The white matter is shown in blue here and in blue here, which are the ascending pathways. Those will be ascending sensory pathways. The two that we just talked about is the one up here, which is the dorsal column system. And this will contain the axonal processes, the conductal processes of sensory neurons whose cell bodies are here in the dorsal root ganglion. They will then have come into the cord and have a branch that enters the dorsal column system and will then ascend the cord all the way up to the brainstem, where they'll form synapses in the dorsal column nucleus. Now, this other pathway down here is said to be the anterolateral system, and the spinothalamic tract is part of the anterolateral system. If you take another course in anatomy, you'll see there are other parts of the anterolateral system, and they have output regions in different places. I just want to here show the idea that we have primary sensory afferents coming in, the second order neuron crosses over and will ascend the cord on the opposite side in this spinothalamic system, but in the subregion of the spinothalamic system called the spinothalamic tract. And what happens on the right side happens on the left, and that's the... If you put your phone away, I'd appreciate it. The idea here is that what we have is symmetry, and that the second order neuron always crosses over. So this is a diagram of what we put on the board. The diagram that we put on the board here first is of the spinothalamic tract. I think I want to go back one. No. This is the one I want. The primary sensory afferent is located here. Cell bodies in dorsal ganglion. It comes into the cord. It will have a branch that goes into the gray matter in the ventral horn, synapse onto the synapse onto the lower motor neuron. The primary sensory afferent then ascends the cord on the same side, forms a synapse onto the second order neuron in the dorsal column nucleus, crosses over, and goes now to the thalamic relay nucleus. The third order neuron then goes to the somatosensory cortex located here. That's the path. So the other diagram here, wrong way. The other diagram here is the spinothalamic tract. Primary sensory afferent synapses onto the second order neuron. It's now the spinothalamic tract because the second order neuron goes from the spinal cord here, the dorsal horn, all the way up to the thalamic relay nucleus. And in the thalamic relay nucleus, again, synapses of the third order neuron goes to the somatosensory cortex. So what does this mean? We don't have much time here to discuss the anatomy. If you put your phone away, I'd appreciate it. We don't have much time to discuss the anatomy of the brain. But what I want to do is point out a couple of landmarks here and describe the generalizations of brain structure. And much of what I'm going to tell you about here in the next few minutes was discovered in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And it was literally discovered on humans during surgery. There was a fellow named Wilder Penfield. And Wilder Penfield was a remarkable neurosurgeon for his time. And what Wilder Penfield was doing is he was doing surgeries to try to alleviate chronic epilepsy, chronic seizures. And he recognized that if he could find the place in the brain where the seizure was originating, if he could go into the brain and cut out that part of the brain where the seizures were started, he could in many cases alleviate the seizure syndromes. This was well before we had good drugs to regulate seizure activity. So he would do this all surgically. But he also, being a good surgeon and a neurobiologist, recognized that if he took out the wrong parts of the brain, bad things could happen. So what he was very careful about was to begin to understand what parts of the brain did what. And so he would do these studies as part of his surgery. He would anesthetize with a local anesthetic the scalp, cut through the scalp, peel back the scalp, take a bone saw, cut through the skull and pop off the skull and look down on the person's brain. Well, this person is completely conscious. And initially, he would do this just with his finger. He would literally start poking at the guy's brain. And he'd poke in one place, and the person would say, "Oh, I feel that in my face." And he'd poke some places, "Oh, I feel that in my leg," or "I feel that in my hand." In other places, he'd poke, and he'd get a motor response. And from doing that, he'd get a movement, and from doing that and doing the mapping, one of the major things he found was that there's a particular region here in the brain It's a very deep valley called the central sulcus. And the central sulcus separated the parietal lobe from the frontal lobe. And he found if he poked on this region of the brain just behind the central sulcus, known as the post-central gyrus, if he poked at the post-central gyrus, people would feel things in a different part of their body. But if he would always poke in the same spot, each individual would feel that in the same spot. He'd poke at a place, and that would be the facial region. Poke at another region, and that would be the hand region. And he did the same thing here on the precentral gyrus. And then he began to find that in the precentral gyrus, and he started to poke here, he'd now get movements, sometimes in the face, sometimes in the feet, sometimes in the hand, depending where along the precentral gyrus he would poke. So the two things I want you to remember here is first, precentral gyrus and postcentral gyrus. Secondly, know that whenever you see precentral gyrus, think motor. Whenever you see postcentral gyrus, think sensory. Now, the other point I want to make from this figure is that when you look at the brain, you're looking at mostly white matter. That when you're looking at the brain, it's only this very, very thin veneer over the cerebrum, which constitutes the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is no more than a couple of millimeters wide. It's a tiny part of the brain. But the cerebral cortex is the region where we have all the neuronal cell bodies. So all of the input regions in the cerebrum are located in that 6-cell layer. Then some subset of those 6 neuronal cell bodies will have axons that now spread out into different parts of the brain. And if you cut down right beneath this exquisitely thin layer of the cortex, you now get into the deeper layers, and that's all white matter. That's all axons. That's all conducting regions that are connecting one cortical region of the brain to the other. So when you look at the brain, and if you pick up a brain and you look at the cerebrum, that cerebrum is mostly white matter. But where the synaptic integration is going on is in this extremely thin veneer of 6 neuronal cell body layers. Well, with that, let's look at the next slide. This slide is meant to represent the so-called somatotopy of the somatosensory cortex. So again, to orient you, let's look at the brain. It's as though I'm facing the wall and we're looking at my left hemisphere. And looking at the left hemisphere, there is this deep fold known as the central sulcus. Immediately behind that deep fold of the central sulcus is the post-central gyrus. And that post-central gyrus now contains the 6 neuronal cell bodies as part of its cortex that is receiving all this information coming in from the thalamic relay neurons. So the thalamic relay neurons, the third-order neurons, are now sending processes up and forming synapses onto the neuronal cell bodies in this region. And this is what Wilder-Penfield found. What Wilder-Penfield found was that if he'd poke in this region, the person would say, "Oh, I feel that in my face." And if he'd poke in this region, he'd say, "Oh, I feel that in my hand." But one of the interesting aspects, if picture photo, I'd appreciate it, one of the interesting aspects of this is that the relative size of the region represented on the cortex was disproportionate to the anatomic size. And that's a fancy way of saying that we're going to have a tremendous amount of sensory information coming in from the face and the lips and the tongue. That's probably for us because we do a lot of things with language. So we need to know where in space our tongue and jaw and teeth are. So we have a tremendous region of the somatosensory cortex that's dedicated to sensory information from that area. Also, we have a lot of sensory information that's dedicated to the hands. So we now end up with having all this information about what's going on in our hands coming in to the somatosensory cortex. So this is the two-dimensional representation of all this. And so, again, if Wilder-Penfield would poke here, he'd get something in the rump, or here he'd get something in the knee. But this great area here would be part of the face or the jaw. Someone has gone to the trouble to put this into a three-dimensional map. And I like this figure because it shows how disproportionate the innervation into the somatosensory cortex in fact is. I mean, look at the size of the lips. Mick Jagger doesn't have lips like that. And that joke is aging with both me and Mick Jagger. I'm aging. And here's the representation of the hand. These are enormous hands. And so again, it's the disproportionate innervation, these tiny wrists. And so it's that disproportionate organization. Now let me show you this image, and then we'll try to make a drawing. This is now, to orient you here, we're now on the precentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus here now has neuronal cell bodies that are going to cause movement of muscle in the tongue, in the face, and the hands. Now again, it's disproportionate. In us, we have a tremendous amount of innervation that goes to facial muscles. This is probably because we're primates and because we are social creatures. We don't notice it much, but when we interact with other people, we interact with them and we get feedback from their muscles of facial expression. You look at somebody, you can tell whether they're happy or sad, angry or what have you. And that's because of these muscles of facial expression. To me, an interesting part of this story is that one of the things that happens as we age is that our facial appearance changes. And to ward off a change in facial appearance, many people will go to the dermatologist and get injections of botulinum toxin. And what the botulinum toxin does is it poisons the vamp. It destroys the vamp so that in those particular muscles, you can no longer activate those muscles. And so then many of the people who go to these great extents to make themselves look younger will then be on set as actors or actresses. And they would then be asked by the director of show an expression. Show me anger. Show me happiness. And the person says, I've paralyzed those muscles, thank you. And I find it interesting that our vanity will take precedence over this important aspect of our lives of regulating these muscles of facial expression. Again, tremendous innervation of muscles of the hands because we do so much with our hands. Now, let me follow this through because we're getting short on time. Let me follow this pathway through. Now, this is going to be a descending pathway. Everything we've talked about so far is sensory ascending. This is going to be motor. So here in the precentral gyrus, in this cortical region, there will be neuronal cell bodies. These neuronal cell bodies are of neurons called upper motor neurons. The cell bodies of these upper motor neurons send a process out. That process skirts the thalamus. It skirts the diencephalon. And in a region known as the internal capsule, we have tremendous numbers of these heavily myelinated axons, which are the conductal processes of the upper motor neurons. If we follow them, they come all the way down to the brainstem. In a region of the brainstem called the medulla, just before the medulla forms the spinal cord, these neurons cross over the midline. That's called the decussation of the pyramids. They cross over the midline, descend the cord in a region known as the lateral corticospinal tract. Note corticospinal. This tells us where the neuronal cell bodies are in the cortex. It tells us they're now going to synapse in the spinal cord. So these upper motor neurons synapse directly onto lower motor neurons that in turn innervate muscle. In this particular case, we're following an upper motor neuron located in a region of the motor cortex that operates the thumb. That will go to the lower motor neuron, then synapse onto the muscle here and cause the thumb to move. So I'll ask you to know that pathway, and next time we'll talk about motor units.